Okay, good morning. So let's start. Okay, so our topic is leases. So, bale, una natin discuss is yung leases on the part of the lessee. So, this is the lessee's perspective. Okay, so tayo yung magbabayad in this case. Okay, so to start, okay, leases. So, lease is a contract or part of contract. So, I will make it quick kasi masyadong mahaba yung chapter na to and baka hindi natin matapos today. So, yung mga long discussions early this chapter, kung hindi naman, kung pwede naman basahin natin on our own, then we will. Okay? Masyado kasi mahaba. So, magpo-focus tayo dun sa computationals, maybe starting page 300 something. Okay? So, this is a contract or part of a contract that conveys the right to use an asset or the underlying asset for a period of time in exchange for consideration. So, ang key term sa lease is laging ito, conveys. So, dapat nata-transfer yung right to use the asset from the lessor to the lessee. So, that is the main substance of lease. So, dapat nata-transfer yung ownership or there is a conveyance of, no, hindi nata-transfer yung ownership. There's a conveyance of right to use the asset. Okay. So, the following are the parties to a lease contract. So, lessee, ito yung take up natin this week. This is the entity that obtains the right to use an underlying asset for a period of time in exchange for consideration. So, this consideration, ito yung rental or lease payments na binabayaran natin kay lessor. And letter B is lessor. So, siya naman yung nagpaparenta. Siya yung may-ari or owner nung property being leased. Okay? So, identifying a lease. So, a contract is or contains a lease if the contract conveys the right to control the use. So, remember ha, ang transfer lang ni lessor from lessee is the right to control or use but not the ownership. Okay? So, it is enough that the lessor will convey the right to use the asset for a lease to be commenced. So, hindi kailangan na i-transfer ownership because that is not a lease, that is a sale per se. Okay? An entity has the right to control the use of an identified asset if it has both of the following throughout the period of use. Letter A is the right to obtain substantially all of the economic benefits from the use of the identified asset. And letter B, the right to direct the use of the identified asset. So, una, kailangan daw lahat ng economic benefits na maririp ni lessee should be belong to lessee in a lease contract. And also, on how the lease property will be used. So, dapat naka-base din yan. So, sa discretion ni lessee. Unless there's a specific or identified na purpose from the lease contract. Which is usually gano'n naman yung purpose. Which is gano'n yung practice. Nandun yung usage of lease contract. Okay, so what is identified asset? Identified asset is the essential definition of the lease. So, an asset can be identified by being explicitly, meaning it is expressed, nakalagay sa kontrata, stated in the contract, or by being implicitly specified at the time the asset is made available for by the customer. So, implicit meaning it is implied. So, it is not directly expressed or stated in the contract, but it is implied by the contract. So, meaning, if magli-list ka ng office space, but not specified as, oh no, not office space. Dapat kasi, pagka office space ang i-renta mo, floor should be expressed in the contract. So, sabihin na lang natin sasakyan. Kung magrerenta ka ng sasakyan, so it is implied na sasakyan yung ibibigay sa'yo at hindi tricycle, di ba? So, yun yun. If it is express, then nakalagay yung plaka, yung chassis number, yung MV, anything na identify dun sa asset na yun. That is identified asset. So, illustration, basahin nyo na lang. Ba't magbigay tayo na isa? So, customer X enters into a 5-year contract with supplier Y for the use of towing truck. So, the specification of truck is stated in the contract. So, it is expressed. Okay? Nakalagay yung brand, engine, capacity, dimension, and anything. So, the towing truck is readily available at the inception of the contract. So, ito lang yung subject matter ng lease natin. So, siya yung identified asset that will be leased. However, the next one is, ito naman yung not yet available yung truck, but it is impliedly included in the contract. Hindi lang expressed kung ano yung specifics or kung ano yung unique unique qualities ng sasakyan na ipaparenta natin. Sorry. So that is the difference between the explicit and implicit asset. Okay? Question. Okay, pala. Then let's continue. Portion of asset. So a portion of asset is identified asset if it is physically distinct. Ito yung sinasabi ko sa inyo. If not physically distinct, the portion is not identified unless it represents substantially all of the capacity of the asset, thereby providing the customer the right to obtain substantially all the economic benefits from the asset. Okay, so example niyan is yung sinabi ko nga kanina na ito, ang example dito is customer X enters into a 10-year contract with supplier Y. So dito ang kontrata nila is to supply 3 fibers out of 15. Okay. So for physically distinct, yung tatlong fiber na yun, let's say fiber 1, 2, and 3, ikaw lang gagamit nun solely para lang sa'yo. So at all times, ito yung 3 fibers na gagamitin mo for your connectivity. However, for not physically distinct contracts, which is hindi stated kung ano yung mga fibers na ikaw lang yung gagamit, like basta nakalagay na lang is 3 fibers will be used to service the connectivity. Then it's either 3, 4, 5, 13, 14, 15. Okay, so you get the point. If it is specifically or physically distinct stated in the contract, then yun lang yung gagamitin mo throughout your lease term. Pero kung not physically distinct, as long as there is a connectivity, so it doesn't matter kung anong fiber man yung gamitin. Okay. So, substantive substitution rights. So, an asset is not an identified asset if the supplier has the substantive right to substitute it throughout the period of use. So, a supplier's right to substitute an asset is substantive if both of the following conditions exist. So, letter A, the supplier has the practical ability to substitute alternate assets throughout the period of use. Example, the customer cannot prevent the supplier from substituting the asset, and alternative assets are readily available to the supplier or could be sourced by the supplier within a reasonable period of time. So, example natin dito is gaya nung kay cables kanina. Okay? So, kung ano man yung cables na available for use and you will substitute it, then this is substantive substitution rights. Okay, so letter B, the supplier would benefit economically from the exercise of its right to substitute the asset. Okay. So that is the first one. There should be an identified asset. Okay. Yun yung una. Next is right to obtain economic benefit from use. So a customer controls the use of an identified asset if it has the right to obtain all of the economic benefits from the asset throughout the period of use. So for example, by having exclusive use of that asset throughout the period. So example is office space. Ito yung pinaka-common na nililis kasi, office space and sasakyan. So, for office space, if the lessee leased office space from the lessor, so dapat lahat ng economic benefits conducted by or that would be gained by the lessee by conducting business on that leased space, dapat it will belong to lessee. Okay? Hindi mo naman pwedeng sabihin na, hindi naman pwedeng sabihin ni, let's say, ang lessor is si Ayala Land. Then may lessee na maliit na company. Hindi naman pwede sabihin ni lessor na, oy, office space ko to. Dapat lahat ng kikitain mo sa akin yan. Diba? So, that is not a lease contract. So, that is an occupied space. So, it should be part of office and equipment ni Ayala Land instead of inventory. Okay? So, since it is income generating sa part ni Ayala, it should not be part of inventory. It should be part of PPE if it is income generating o on his part. Pero kung ang purpose naman niya is i-list out siya, then investment property dapat yung treatment niya. Hindi dapat PPE. Okay. Let's continue. Economic benefits include potential inflows from the asset's output, which can be obtained directly or indirectly from using, holding, or subleasing the asset. Okay, so ito yung meaning ng qualities na to. So dapat the lessee has the right to obtain economic benefits from the use of the leased asset. Okay. Next is right to direct the use. So a customer has the right to direct the use of an identified asset throughout the period of use if the customer has the right to direct how and for what purpose the asset is used. And letter B, the use is predetermined and the supplier is precluded from changing that predetermined use. So ito yung nakalagay sa contract natin, yung predetermined use. But there is always a clause that the company can change the purpose or the use of that leased asset for as long as there is a consensus or magkakasundo sila. It depends on them. But there will be always a predetermined usage of the leased property. So, pwede niyang gawin yan as office space, pwede niyang gawing uh, operations or manufacturing hub as long as may consensus. Okay? Kasi baka naman yun ay office space. Tapos bigla mo siyang gagawing factory, di ba? Mag-aakit ka ng heavy machineries, which is hindi naman allowed sa lahat ng establishment. So, there should be a consensus on that part. Or dapat magkakasundo sila. There is an agreement. Okay? So, that sums up yung right to direct the use. So, basahin nyo na lang dito yung mga specifics. Protective rights. Protective rights include contractual restriction designed to protect the supplier's interest in the asset or its personnel or to ensure compliance with laws and regulation. For example, a contract may specify the maximum amount of the use of an asset or limit where or when the customer can use the asset. Number two, it requires a customer to follow particular operating procedures. And number three, require a customer to inform the supplier of changes on how asset will be used. So, ito yon. Okay? Ito yung sinasabi natin kanina. So, protective rights typically define the scope of the customer's right of use, but do not, in isolation, prevent the customer from having the right to direct use of an asset. So, technically, this is only a limitation on what the lessee can do on the leased property. Since, again, lessor still owns the ownership. Okay? Hindi pa naman tinatransfer yung ownership. So, though the lessee has the uh, right to use, but the lessor still owns it. Okay. So, flowchart. So, is there an identified asset? So, kung identified yung asset, like sa mga tiniscuss natin earlier, then proceed tayo sa susunod. Did the lessee has the right to obtain the substantially all of the economic benefits? If no, then it is not a lease, not a finance lease. Okay? It is, in this case, kung hindi nata-transfer yung ownership, baka ano yan, investment pa or PPE yan ni ni lessor or internal business niya yan. Hindi yan business, uh, hindi yan conduct of business involving yung mga external parties like lessee. Okay? Next, does the customer have the right to direct the use? So, kaya ba niyang uh, gamitin yung asset the way na gusto niya? If yes, then there is a lease. Again, if no, then it means no. Kung no means na hindi niya i-direct yung use, I mean, kung kaya niyang i-direct yung use within the limits and scope nung ito nga, protective rights, then there is a lease. But if no, sorry, if walang ganun, then it is not a lease. Okay? So, identifying a lease. So, isa-isahin nyo na lang to. Medyo madami kasi to. Okay? Lang naman i-check. Try nyo i-check if there is a lease by identifying if there's an identified asset, right to obtain economic benefits, and right to direct the use. And may sagot naman yan sa baba. Okay. So, lease term. So, lease term is the non-cancelable period of a lease together with both letter A, periods covered by an option to extend the lease if the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise the option. Letter B, periods covered by an option to terminate the lease if the lessee is reasonably certain not to exercise the option. Okay, so a non-cancelable period is the period in which the contract is enforceable, and a lease is no longer enforceable when each of the lessor and lessee can terminate the lease without permission from other and subject only to an insignificant penalty. So, ito yung usually na nalilimutan natin, especially sa old standard. Okay? Kapag kasi significant yung penalty, then still, there is a chance na the lease is still enforceable. Okay? So, meron kasing malaking penalty if you terminate or pre-terminate the lease before dun sa end of the lease term. Like, okay, pwede mong i-cancel yung lease 1 year prior, provided nagbabayad ka ng 10 times nung rent mo for that year. So, it doesn't make any sense, diba? So, ituloy mo na lang. At least, nakamura ka na, nagagamit mo pa yung property. Instead na, hindi mo na nga magagamit, magbabayad ka pa ng mas malaki, diba? So, that is considered to be enforceable. Okay? Though there is a option to terminate. Okay? If only the lessee has the right to terminate the lease, the lessee considers this right when determining the lease term. So whether exercise is reasonably certain or not, and if only the lessor has the right to terminate a lease, the non-cancelable period of the lease includes the period covered by the option to terminate the lease. Okay, tandaan nyo if only the lessee has the right to terminate the lease, then the lessee considered this right when determining the lease term. Okay, so whether you exercise niya or not, but if only the lessor has the right to terminate the lease, then the non-cancelable period lease includes the period covered by the option to terminate the lease. So, i-add mo yan whether uh, i- i-exercise mo or hindi. Or i-exercise or hindi ni lessor. Included yan. However, if the lessee has the right to terminate, then it should be based on whether it is reasonable or not reasonable that the lessee will exercise the right to terminate the lease. Ay, it depends. So, in assessing whether a lessee is reasonable certain to exercise an option to extend a lease or not to exercise an option to terminate a lease, an entity considers all relevant facts and circumstances that create an economic incentive for the lease. Okay, so madaming factors yan. Ito yung mga example niya dito. O the lessee may be reasonably certain to exercise an option to extend the lease if the lease is below the lease payments on extended period are expected to be below market rate, and the lessee made significant leasehold improvement with useful life longer than original lease term. Or pwede rin yung ito yung susunod. The lessee may reasonably certain not to exercise the option to terminate the lease if the cost of terminating the lease are significant, which is yung sinabi ko natin earlier, masyado malaki yung babayaran, or in this example is relocation cost, or mahihirapan siyang humanap ng kapalit agad-agad, and they will need time para makahanap ng another list asset for lease. Okay? So the shorter the non-cancelable period is, the more likely that a lessee will exercise its right to extend the lease, because the shorter the non-cancelable period is, the more likely that the cost associated with obtaining a replacement asset would be higher. So meaning, mas maikli yung time niya maghanap ng kapalit, then mas urgent yung need niya, then mas mahal yung price. Ano talaga, pagka mataas yung demand, taas din yung price. So yung demand niya is high, di ba? Kailangan na niyang humanap agad since there is a shorter time. So meaning, it is more likely that the lessor will exercise the right instead of magsettle siya sa mas mahal na lease. Okay? So sa industry kasi ng leasing, masyado kasing mahal if kailangan mo na siya like 3 or 6 months from now, i-occupy mo na siya, mahal yun. But if you will enter a lease a year or two before ka mag-occupy dun sa leased asset, then mas makakamura ka. Okay? Illustration. Okay, again, basahin nyo na lang to. Yung option to extend. May sagot naman yan dito. Okay. So, next is accounting for leases by lessee. So, this is the point of view of lessee. Recognition. So, a lessee recognizes a lease liability and right of use at the commencement date. So, itong standard na to is very new. If I'm not mistaken, 2018, 2019 lang siya. Kasi during our time, 2014, right of use asset does not exist. Wala pa siya. So, we only recognize lease liability. So, technically, pagka nagli-lease ng office space, then magde-debit ka ng asset, particular dun sa office space, like leasehold, debit leasehold, credit lease liability. So, ganun lang siya. Pero ngayon kasi, uniform na yung name niya. I'm not sure kung yun lang ang binago, pero debit right of use asset, office space, and credit lease liability. So, yun na siya. And at the same time, yung treatment din sa asset is different na. So, maraming changes sa recognition, especially sa mga items included sa right of use asset, which is i-discuss naman natin today. Okay? So, initial measurement of lease liability. So, the lease liability is initially measured at the present value of the lease payments that are not yet paid at the commencement date. So, not yet paid. So, meaning paid rent included, or rent, or sorry, lease liability paid in advance is not included sa lease liability, okay, at the time of commencement date. So, kung bayad na siya, then it should not be part of liability anymore. So, dapat nakatuloy credit cash na siya. Recognize mo na siya as expense. So, lease payment include the following. Fixed payments, including in-substance fixed payment, less any lease incentive receivable. Letter B, variable lease payments that depend on an index or a rate initially measured using the index or rate as at the commencement date. So, usually used dito is CPI or Consumer Price Index. So, familiar kayo lahat dito sa CPI na to. Letter C is the amount expected to be payable by the lessee under residual value guarantees. Ito yung RV natin. Letter D, exercise price of a purchase option if the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise that option. This is at discounted value. And letter E, payment of penalties for terminating the lease if the lease term reflects the lessee exercising an option to terminate the lease. Okay, if there is reasonable certainty na to terminate nyo yung lease. Okay. And lease payment do not include payment for non-leased elements. So except when the entity elects to apply the practical expedient. So this practical expedient is quite new. Bago rin to. Actually, it only means that the entity will include yung initial direct cost. Kung mapapansin nyo dito, initial direct cost is not included sa lease payments, di ba? But under FASB, it is allowed to include the initial direct cost through the principle of practical expedient. Okay? What is practical expedient? I-discuss natin yan later. But, again, ito lang yun. I-include mo yung initial direct cost. If it is more uh, comfortable para sa lessee and if it is more uh, economic. So, kung hindi masyadong mahihirapan i-identify yung initial direct cost or it will take more cost para ma-identify yung initial direct cost, then it should be part under the theory of practical expedient. Okay, for a while. Okay. So, next, payments in, sorry. Payment for next. Okay. Okay, so do not include payments in optional extension period unless the extension is reasonably certain. So it is not included for extension period unless the extension is reasonably certain. But for sure, hindi natin malalaman yan at the inception date. Malalaman lang natin yan once matatapos na yung lease. So unless it is reasonably certain, then we will include it. Future changes in variable payments that depends on an index rate. And lastly, variable payments linked to the lessee's future sales or usage of the underlying asset. So ito yung mga variable rents or variable lease payments, which is nandito. Okay? So ito yung mga variable lease na kasama at using the index or rate as at the commencement date. However, ito naman is based on future changes. Okay? So that is the difference. Discount rate. The lease payment are discounted using the interest rate implicit in the lease. So, what is interest rate implicit in the lease? So, ito yung interest rate of the same kind of lease. So, usually, ma-identify mo naman yan sa market. Given naman siya lagi. Okay, so if that rate is not readily determinable, then the lessee's incremental borrowing rate is used. So, kung magkano yung ginamit niya, what is the interest rate na na-incur niya in case na nanghiram siya ng gagamitin niya. para dun sa lease. Okay? So, the lessee's incremental borrowing rate is the rate at interest the lessee would have to pay to borrow over a similar term. Okay? And with a similar security, the funds necessary to obtain an asset is of a similar value of the right of use asset in a similar economic environment. So, as we have stated kanina, kung ano yung may incur niya. Okay? So, initial measurement, right of use of asset is initially measured at cost. So, the cost comprises the following. So, letter A, the amount of initial measurement of lease liability. So, ito yung kasama sa right of use of asset natin. Letter B, any lease payment made at or before the commencement date unless any lease incentive received. Okay. So, ito yung sinasabi ko na lease paid in advance. So, kasama siya sa right of use asset but it is not included sa lease liability natin. Okay? Letter C, any initial direct cost incurred by the lessee. So, again, initial direct cost is part of right of use of asset but it is not part of uh, lease liability. Okay? And letter D, present value of any decommissioning, restoration costs for which the entity has incurred an obligation unless these costs are incurred to produce inventories. Okay. So, tandaan nyo to initial direct cost is part of right of use of asset since nagastos mo siya. So, dapat kasama siya sa i-depreciate mo because you would not incur that cost unless hindi ka nag-avail no lease, di ba? So, this is increment cost sa right of use asset. However, sa lease liability, hindi siya part since there is no transfer of right of use or there is no economic benefits that na kukuha ang company dito sa payment nito because it is already paid. So, next is subsequent measurement of lease liability. So, the lease liability is subsequently measured similar to an amortized cost financial liability. So, we will use effective interest method again for lease liability. So, interest on the lease liability is computed using the effective interest method and recognized in P&L unless it forms part of the carrying amount of another asset. So, interest in each period reflects a constant periodic rate of interest on the remaining balance of the lease liability. And lease payments are apportioned between the interest and a reduction to the lease liability. Okay. So, all payments will be deducted sa lease liability. However, yung ating right of use asset will be depreciated over the lease term or the life of the asset. But it depends. Okay. So, subsequent measurement of right of use asset. So, the right of use asset is subsequently measured similar to our purchase asset. So, accordingly, the asset is subsequently measured under the cost model except when it relates to a class of PPE, that is measured under the revaluation model, in which case the asset may be measured under revaluation model. Okay, if there is the same class of PPE that is measured currently on revaluation model, then pwede mo siyang i-categorize or i-measure subsequently through revaluation model as well. And it letter B, if it meets the definition of an investment property and the entity uses the fair value model, in which case the asset is measured under the fair value model. In case if it is an investment property or if there is any asset that the lessee has, like halimbawa sasakyan, investment property niya yun, then you can treat the lease under fair value model. Okay? So, cost model. Under the cost model, the right of use asset is measured at cost less any accumulated depreciation and impairment losses. And letter B, adjusted for any remeasurement of the lease liability. Okay, so if there is a changes in lease liability, there is always a change or corresponding change kay right of use asset. So depreciation, the lessee depreciates the underlying asset over its useful life if the contract provides for the transfer of ownership to the lessee by the end of the lease term, or there is a reasonable certainty that the lessee will exercise a purchase option. Okay, ito yung sinasabi ko na it depends kanina kung saan nyo siya i-depreciate, if it is the lease term or the useful life. So, kung merong transfer of ownership to the lessee at the end of the lease term, then the lessee should depreciate it at useful life. Okay? And if also there is a reasonable certainty that the lessee will exercise a purchase option, then the lessee should also depreciate the asset at useful life. However, if uh, both of these are missing, or at least one, so there is no, a while, okay, there is no transfer of ownership and there is no reasonable certainty that the lessee will exercise the purchase option, then the entity should only depreciate it over the lease term. Okay? Ito siya. In any other case, the lessee depreciates the underlying asset over the shorter of the asset's useful life and the lease term. So depreciation starts from the commencement date of the lease. Okay. Oops. Ito pala. So general recognition. So example tayo. On January 1, 2021, Entity X enters into a 3-year lease of equipment for an annual rent of 100,000 payable at the end of each year. So the equipment has a remaining useful life at 10 years. The interest rate implicit in the lease is 10%, while the lease's incremental borrowing rate is 12%. Since it is given, itong gagamitin natin. Entity X uses the straight line method of depreciation. So initial measurements of lease liability and right of use assets are as follows. So fixed payment is 100,000 and multiplies up PV of an ordinary annuity. So present value of 1 at 10% at 3 periods. So ito siya. 2.48. Multiply lang natin. Then ito yung present value of our lease payments. And this is also the present value no or yung value ng right of use asset natin. So debit right of use asset and credit lease liability. Okay? So interest is amortized as amortization is also amortized based on effective interest method. Okay? So multiply lang natin siya by 10%. Then this is the interest and the difference will be the amortization of the liability. Okay. Next is subsequent measurement, right of use asset. So the right of use asset is subsequently measured under the cost model. Because the lease contract neither provides for the transfer of ownership to the lessee nor a reasonable certain purchase option as it is absent dun sa given natin. Hindi siya mentioned. So, we can say na walang transfer of ownership. So, the annual depreciation using the straight line method is computed as follows. So, i-divide lang natin siya by 3. Wala namang residual value na binigay. Okay. So, let's continue. So, interest expense is 24,000 for the first year. Given naman siya dito. And lease liability, debit, 75,132. Then, credit cash. So, this is the first payment. Ito yung entry niya. And ito yung depreciation naman ng right of use asset natin. So, the entries in these 2 years continue in the same pattern. So, ito lang yung gagamitin natin data para ma-entry yung next two entries. Okay. So, under past 17, the list described in the illustration above would most likely be classified as an operating list. In this case, the total expense over the lease term is 300,000 at an annual rent of 100,000. So, under PFRS 16, the total expense over the lease term, interest and depreciation is also 300,000. But this is front-loaded, meaning the expense is higher in the earlier years, resulting from recognizing interest at a constant rate on the outstanding liability, which is correct. Front-loaded meaning mas malaki yung na-incur mo at the commencement or the beginning of uh, the lease kasi mas malaki yung lease liability natin the start of the lease, then the bulk of interest will be on the first year. Okay? Though, as a whole, we will still incur 300,000 in total payments. Okay? So, we cannot say na the expense is evenly throughout the lease term, but it is not. It is front-loaded. Okay. Okay. So, question. Okay. Okay, walang question. Then, let us continue. Recognition exemption. So, a lessee may elect not to apply the recognition requirements described earlier for lease liability and right of use asset for short-term leases, which is the effect of discounting is very low. So, hindi mo na siya kailangan i-discount pagka ganun kababa. And within 1 year lang siya, natatapos na. Then, you can consider it as operating lease. And letter B, leases for which the underlying asset is of low value. So, kung mababa lang yung halaga. Okay, so what determines low value? Again, it depends on the materiality of the transaction, depending on the company. Again, so short-term lease is a lease that at the commencement date has lease term of 12 months or less. So this lease contains a purchase option. It's not a short-term lease. So kahit may purchase option siya, so hindi siya short-term lease. Okay? Okay. So the election of short-term lease is made on the class, so grouping of assets with similar nature and use of underlying asset to which the right of use relates. Okay? So usually, as we have mentioned, short-term leases are only the lease that would be terminated 12 months or less. And low value assets. So ito yung mga low value assets. Again, it depends on the materiality of uh, the asset to the company. So however, basahin na rin natin. The asset of value is based on the value of the asset when it is new, regardless of the age of the asset being leased. For example, so old car cannot qualify as low value asset because a car when new is not considered of low value. So the assessment is performed on an absolute basis, meaning it is not affected the materiality of the lease's size, nature, and circumstances. So this an asset is considered of low value regardless of whether the lessee is a small or big company. So that is one of the changes. So on old standard, uh, low value asset is considered to be operating lease if it is low value in consideration with the entity. But for now, I will correct it. It is not uh, affected by materiality anymore. Okay. So, naka-base na siya on its absolute value. Sa absolute basis. Kung ang sasakyan ay mahal, then kahit gaano kayaman yung company, then you should take it as uh, finance lease, okay? Kahit yung naililis mo na sasakyan ay luma na, but still, car is not considered to be of low value, then you will consider it as a lease. Okay, so ito yung mga example of low value assets. So, ito yung tablet, PCs, and furniture. Okay, okay. So next, accounting. The lessee may elect to recognize the lease payment associated with with a short-term lease or lease of low-value asset as an expense of the straight line on a straight line basis over the lease term, unless another systematic basis is more representative of the pattern of the lessee's benefit. So this is for short-term lease. Straight line basis is allowed. Okay. Okay, so for illustration, makikita naman natin dito. Basic lang yung computation, then you can check on it. Okay. So illustration 2, okay, option to terminate for this term. Okay, may analysis naman, so please just check on it. Okay. So separating the components of a contract. So dito naman sa separating the components of a contract, there are times kasi na mag-release ka ng isang asset, which is set. Like, ang given niya dito is, I believe, is yung printer, if I'm not mistaken. Ba yan? Okay. Anyway, it is already 12. So, balikan natin itong separating the components of a lease contract after you take your lunch. Okay, so we will regroup at 12:30. Okay, take your lunch. Bye-bye.